human behavior and human emotions. Any comments on these? You've seen these before?
I was just thinking as a listener, just as you were describing it, I was thinking, you know, like as a communications student, listening, I always feel like the pathos is the part that I'm kind of watching for distrustfully, really. I mean, not as a motivator, but as kind of a trap to get me to think in a way that doesn't make sense.
Well, it's going to be well, you would be a sort of Platonic, and that emotion warps the judgment.
But was he saying that it was simply effective, or was he saying it was effective and good?
Aristotle would say it is always effective, and it's better if it's used for good purposes than for bad purposes.
But in and of itself, it's not.
It's just,
like, you get to ethos in and of itself. You know, being credible, knowing what you're talking about, is a good thing. You know?
Well, I think it was kind of a. This has to happen for the mass of people.
Right.
You have to move there. Augustine said this too. I think it was Augustine who had the phrase that we, or who had the phrase? We move the will. You have to move the emotions to move the will. You know, so if you don't move people's emotions, their will, they're not going to change their behaviors. So, yeah. So he talked about logos, ethos, pathos, logos as important. He also gave us the 5 canons. So just or suggested the 5 canons. One of which is invention. That the first challenge a rhetorician faces is to figure out what are the possible arguments that can be made. So we had to discover them. And they had a whole description of this in the rhetoric about what are common forms of argument that you can make. So you would almost go through his list and say, does this one work? Does this one work? Does this one work? Does this one work? You know, more or less, better or worse. You know, you can apply some stock arguments. Is there a more or less argument that works here? Is there a better or worse argument that works here? And so you talked about invention, and then once you had your stuff all together, then you had to arrange it. So you had to say, well, given this audience, which would go first? Because you're always thinking. Another part of rhetorical analysis is you have the speaker, you have the message, you have the audience, and you have the situation. And you've got to take all these into account when you're creating your message for people. So you ask the question, all right, I've got my set of arguments. Now, which will I select to use? Which ones will I pull out in order to appeal to this group of people? So you have invention, you have arrangement. I'm missing one in my mind right now. Style. Then I'll just get them down here so I don't forget. Delivery, memory, and delivery. So these are the 5 canons you have to work your way through in the presentation. So you find out what are the possible arguments. So like in a undergraduate class, I was doing this recording industry lawsuit against a woman for $220,000 about the file sharing. I don't know if you follow this news article, but this woman had Kazaa on her computer. She was aiding and abetting the theft of copyrighted material by having 24 songs on her computer or something else. And the recording industry decided to go after her and they fined her $220,000 for file sharing. And so she's appealing it. So we, in the undergraduate class, we took time to pretend that we were PR people for the recording, RIAA, for the Recording Industry Association. Now, if we're invited to speak on a college campus or to some setting, this is what we need to think about. We need to go through and say, well, who am I? What's my message? Who's the audience? What's the situation? You know, the situation is that there's a lawsuit pending. You know, the audience is college students maybe that I'm asked to speak to. My message I'm working on. And who is the speaker? Well, if it's a 50-year-old white male, it may not be the right person to be the spokesperson. We may want somebody else to go do this speaking. So we ask a speaker who's the right spokesperson for us. And then we work on our message. What are the possible arguments? How do I arrange them? What language or approach will I take? Will I be formal or informal? Will I be combative or friendly? Will I speak in the language of the students, you know, or will I adopt a different speech code or language that I use? I have to ask myself all these questions. Then I have to ask myself, what will be the mechanism for my presenting? Will I memorize this? Or will I use a teleprompter? Or will I use, cards? Or will I have notes? Or will I have a PowerPoint? You know, how am I going to get this message? Of course, they didn't have any of that, so they memorized everything. And people who memorize long things have tricks for how to do it. You know, and they used a spatial metaphor of a house in their memory. They created a vision of a house that represented their speech. And there would be things in the house that would remind them of what they wanted to talk about. So they would imagine as they spoke, they would walk through the house. And that would carry them through their message. So that was the mnemonic device that they used. Ben?
When you're trying to convince someone of something like this, how often is it more beneficial to be combative? Because it seems to me that it would help to be friendly. I mean, maybe in this situation it wouldn't, but are there situations when you need to be more combative?
Well, right. The theoretical thing that you're talking about is what's called expectancy violation theory. Okay, so there are theories about this, that there are certain expectations of how we should behave in settings. But there are times when it may be profitable or beneficial in the communication encounter to violate those expectations. And there are theories about under what circumstances does the violation create a positive valence or a negative valence is the terminology that's used. So, and there are certain, like for instance, it's not generally considered proper for me to shout across the room at a student, right? To say something, shout across the room. But there are certain contexts where that might actually be perceived as a friendly gesture if there had been some things that led up to it. So when we violate, like you do with your friends, you call friends names sometimes, or you bust on them, you know, and that's a violation in some settings. But because of the context, it's actually promotes a positive valence. So yeah, so there are studies done about when might you be advised to violate an expectation and it would yield a positive valence. Yes. But I can't, it's generally a highly complex set of things that are looked at.
I was just, it's funny, I just heard a really good example of just what we were talking about. They were on NPR, they were playing examples because Rudy Giuliani was mayor for 8 years and he had a weekly radio show. People would call in and, being the guy that he was, every now and then he would go off on the caller. And the particular one that they chose was, you know, he had said, I don't know, it turns out that ferrets like will chew a baby's face off in 3 seconds if they smell, you know, when they smell baby breath. Who knew it, right? So he said, that's it, no more ferrets in New York City. And some guy called up and said, well, no, wait a minute, I have a ferret. And he just went off on the guy and said, you know, you need to get help. Because if this is the most important thing in your life, you know, whether you can have a ferret or not, in this city at this time. And I think what he was kind of banking on was that there was a silent majority of ferret haters, you know, that he was appealing to.
Right.
You know, he kind of had a hunch that he could kind of get away with it.
Yeah, I can get away with this, and it'll have a positive valence in the end.
Yeah, which it did.
And
you know, all these years later, you listen to it, and I was driving along, and I kind of had to laugh a little bit because I was thinking, you know, whatever you say about him, he kind of calls it as he sees it.
Yeah, well, but EVT can work against, you know, expectancy violation theory can work against you if you're not careful, because you can be chummy with somebody where it's the wrong thing to do,
Right.
and it just, you know, puts a whole negative outcome. So,
it's not really about rhetoric, but it's about like the traditions as a whole.
yeah.
When you have like, you know that there are certain theories that describe stuff, right?
Yes.
Do they like, when someone creates a theory, do they say my theory is under this tradition, or is it like up to the reader to kind of stick it where they want?
Generally up to the reader to figure it out. Yeah, I mean, Craig's approach is kind of new. I'm sorry, I'm just laughing. I think when you say, well, I have this theory, I think of the Saturday Night Live Brontosaurus thing. Did any of you seen the Brontosaurus theory sketch? Anyway, we have to find it. Somebody find it for us on YouTube somewhere. It's got to exist. But it's a Saturday Night Live thing about someone saying, well, I have a theory about brontosauruses. You know, and the interviewer, oh, what's your theory of brontosauruses? Oh, they are large.
I thought the book was going to be like, okay, this is the rhetoric tradition. Like, here are theories that are under the rhetoric, but it's not. So that's why I was just like...
Well, which book is not?
This one.
Okay. Well, these are primary readings.
Yeah.
Primary source readings.
Like, I don't know. It just like confused me a little bit.
Okay.
You know, like, you have like, there were like communication theory, you know, like to help describe.
Yeah, rhetoric is a little different. Rhetoric itself is considered a whole sort of approach to things. Whereas, like Littlejohn, you'll notice, leaves rhetoric out. He doesn't do rhetorical theory because he knows it's such a huge field. And his wife writes in rhetorical studies. So she probably said, don't you dare put it in there. You know, needs its own book. And Sonia Foss is his wife. I mean, or Karen Foss. They're two sisters, and one of them is Littlejohn's wife. I can't remember which one. But she's on the cover of the book. But she's a rhetorician. She writes feminist rhetorical, no, the Green Book. Yeah, it doesn't matter. It's not important right now. But yeah, so you won't find like so many theories structured under, was it Karen or?
Karen.
Karen, okay, yeah. They're sisters, they're both scholars, they're both professors, they both write, so, yeah.
I think of those like family.
What?
Those family dinners.
Yeah, yeah. Have Bob Craig. Let's have Bob Craig over. Yeah, okay. Yeah, or Stephen Littlejohn or Barnett Pierce, because Littlejohn and Pierce work together a lot.
I had that at my old school too. Two of my teachers, they were both interpersonal professors.
Right.
And I was like, wow, I can't imagine. And like, he would use like stories about her, and then, like not a lot of people knew that they were married. But he'd be like, so my wife, and he would like tell stories. And I'm like, I can't even imagine like what a fight in that
Yeah, right. Yeah, be a very structured event. Yeah. What theory are we going to work on tonight? All right, so you have invention, arrangement, style, memory, and then delivery, which has to do with voice and speech improvement, your pace, your monotone, your vocal variety, all of these things. So those of you who have taught public speaking, like Jeff, you know, you've taught public speaking, and you do now, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you go through all these things with students.
And the logos, pathos, ethos part, yeah, that's about as much as...
Yeah, I mean, these are very useful, especially the situation, because Lloyd Bitzer writes a lot about the rhetoric, because Aristotle really didn't talk about the situation. But if there's something that has happened, like Britney Spears, we were talking about Britney Spears earlier today, you know, with the children. If she's in a situation where there are arguments being made, but if there were something that happened in New York or Los Angeles or somewhere else, where a child under the care of a mother who was inebriated or high fell off a fire escape and died, that would then change the arguments going on in Britney Spears' case. So the situation affects the messages as well. So a rhetorical scholar or rhetorical practitioner has to take all these into account when they're taking care of their stuff. All right, so all right, so that'll start us off, and maybe we'll go to the text now, and maybe we'll start looking at the rhetoric itself first, Aristotle's rhetoric. This is reading 7. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one. I'll point out some things, highlights as we go. Of it. So important things to look at here is the very first sentence, of course, is famous in the rhetoric. That rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic. So in his mind, there are two basic ways people speak to each other. They speak calmly in a search for absolute truth, and then, or they speak to masses in order to deliberate and persuade. And he says there are current treatises on rhetoric. So, second paragraph now, the framers of the current treatises on rhetoric have constructed but a small portion of their art. Okay? And so he goes on, he talks about them. These writers, however, say nothing about enthymemes. Now, the enthymeme is a rhetorical syllogism. So you know about syllogisms in logic. You know, how does that one go? All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Socrates is immortal. You know, so you have a general premise. You have another specific point, and then you have a conclusion from it. So it's a deductive process from general to specific. So for Aristotle, there are two things. There's the enthymeme, which is the deductive, and then there's the example, which is the inductive.
What is something, I don't know if you ever like heard it, but it was like apples and oranges, it's like fruit, how it doesn't always work, like.
Oh, okay,
apples,
all apples are orange. No.
Like all apples are fruit, like oranges are fruit, like.
Yeah, I don't know.
But it's basically
Logical
like
fallacies.
Yeah, like because all apples are fruit, and then what is a fruit? Like oranges are fruit, therefore like all oranges.
They're apple. I haven't seen that recently. Yeah, I'd have to look at it.
I had it in like 2 of my books. So I thought it was like a comment.
No, I don't know that one. But for Aristotle, he argued that in dialectic you have syllogisms. But in rhetoric, you have enthymemes, which are a rhetorical syllogism where one part is left out. So, for instance, if we were saying about Britney Spears, let's make a syllogism about Britney Spears. The general premise is that parents who are inebriated or high or addicted should not be in charge of children. Right? That's a general premise, right? Britney Spears is addicted, inebriated, and high. So there's the next line. So therefore, the conclusion is she should not be in charge of children. You know, so there's a dialectical syllogism. But Aristotle argued that if you're arguing with people, it's not your best shot at it to say to them, listen, any parent who, and Britney Spears, therefore she should not. It doesn't work that way. You say one of them, and the audience supplies the other one. So if you were arguing this, you could say, parents who are inebriated or high or addicted shouldn't be in charge of children. Britney Spears should not have her kids. Well, you've actually left something out. Logically, you've left something out. But you can expect the audience to provide that. And Aristotle will argue that that makes your argument more powerful, because the audience has actually cooperated with you in the forming of your argument. Or he would say, you might argue, Britney Spears is addicted and high and inebriated. She shouldn't be allowed to be in charge of children. You've left out the general premise that a parent who is inebriated, but logically your audience has supplied it to you. So they have now partnered with you in the creation of an argument, which strengthens your, as Burke would say, your identification. Aristotle is not so much about this identification, consubstantiation thing as Burke is. So that's the enthymeme, which he thinks is so important. That's a very powerful way of arguing. Down at the bottom of the first page there, he says, it is not right to pervert the judge by moving him to anger or envy or pity. One might as well warp a carpenter's rule before using it. So there's your emotion. That it's like, you know, taking your ruler and heating it up and bending it, you know, and it's not going to measure straight anymore. So emotion distorts the judgment, the faculty of judgment. But he's going to say that truth, you know, has a natural tendency to prevail, and we need to help it do that. So on the top of page 123, first column, second paragraph. Rhetoric is useful because things that are true and things that are just have a natural tendency to prevail over their opposites. So that's a, you know, circle, mark, highlight kind of a statement for Aristotle. And so that if the decisions of judges are not what they ought to be, the defeat must be due to the speakers themselves. They must be blamed accordingly. And then his second one is kind of his reflection that most audiences are not philosophers. But for some audiences, not even the possession of the exactest knowledge will make it easy for what we say to produce conviction. For the argument based on knowledge implies instruction, and there are people whom one cannot instruct. So your best shot with the masses is to be a good rhetor and use ethos, pathos, logos in the service of what is true and just. Because there are some people who cannot be instructed, and a popular audience is like that. So that's kind of a, I mean, if you're highly democratic, you may have a problem with that, right? So that's kind of a benevolent look at the masses, you know. Well, they can't figure this out anyway, so we'll just persuade them. And then in number 3 there on that column, he says, we must be able to employ persuasion on opposite sides of a question. But in order that we may see clearly what the facts are and be able to argue them. So he argues that all good things can be used in a harmful way, that there's a right use and a wrong use of power. And so he wants the rhetor to do what's right. So it was a moral purpose. Over on page 123, second column, about halfway down, he says, what makes a man a sophist is not his faculty, but his moral purpose. So you may have a person who's skilled in persuasion and not be a lousy, rotten sophist. If he has a good moral purpose, he's not. Okay. So he talks again about untrained thinkers. Down on page 125, second column, last full paragraph there, he starts to talk about the contingent things. So he says, there are few facts of the necessary type that can form the basis of rhetorical syllogism. Most of the things about which we make decisions present us with alternative possibilities. For it is about our actions that we deliberate and inquire, and all our actions have a contingent character. Hardly any of them are determined by necessity. So there are some things that are determined, but there are some things that are, they could be this way, they could be that way. We've got to figure it out. And rhetoric will help us to figure out what we as civic beings should do. So it deals with probabilities, that it's more probable that this is the course of action than that's the course of action we should take. There's no exact proof. This is not logic. This is rhetoric. So it's more likely that this is true and better than that is true. It deals with probabilities. All right. So yeah, on page 129, the first column, first paragraph, about halfway down, he says, the truth is, as we have already said, rhetoric is a combination of the science of logic and the ethical branch of politics. So it's not a strict science. So we'll get into this, right, with scientific theories of communication that want to use quantitative hypothesis, thesis methods. He says this is not a science, a dialectical logic science. It's a practical faculty. Okay. So, and then he goes into all the different different types, and you get a feel for what goes on. I would encourage you, if you want to read the rhetoric, George Kennedy has made a translation of it with some annotations and comments as you go through. It's a good one, George Kennedy's translation, if you're interested to read it.
It just like reminds me a lot, I guess maybe because they were talking about juries too, but like, you know, there's some things where it's like really clear, you know, if there's a car accident or something, this person hit that person.
Yes.
You know, you have stuff that there's like physical evidence, but then there are a lot of things, and I guess it's more like, you know, sexual harassment suits and stuff like that, where there really isn't evidence, but it's kind of just like, okay, what's like right and wrong, and like,
yeah.
When I was reading it, that's kind of like what I was thinking about. Like, there's really no way to tell, like, is this person lying, is it not? Like, you have people sit up there, do they look shady that they would do it? Does she look whatever? And you kind of just have to, like, guess it at, you know what I mean? Like,
well, you judge, Aristotle says we all judge on the basis of multiple things. In an ideal world, you know, Plato's world, we would all be logicians, and everything would be based on facts alone. Evidence, facts.
But like even so there, you don't even know, like, when it's something like he said, she said,
right.
You can't even know like what the facts
right.
are. So
yeah.
You have to take, you can't use logic, you have to take the others into
right.
account.
Which is why Aristotle builds it in, right? And it's human. It's part of human beingness. So you may encounter in your life and people who want to live in Plato's world. They don't want to deal with your emotions. They don't care how you feel about something. These are the facts, you know. And that doesn't usually go very well in business, and it usually doesn't go very well in life or relationships, because we are beings who have more than minds. We have emotions, we have will. And within the field of communication studies, sometimes people will study something called emotional intelligence, and which has to do with the ability to be not only logically intelligent, but emotionally